science communication. And I think we can all agree that the events of the past few months that have led to us being here on our computers really highlight that fact even more. First with the coronavirus and the global pandemic, and now with the increased attention on systemic racism and police violence in our society. So at times like this, when headlines are changing so rapidly, it can be hard for a lot of people to separate fact from fiction or from opinion. And these types of misinformation and even conspiracy theories have always made our jobs more difficult, let alone when that's compounded with us trying to communicate science that's happening sort of in real time in front of the public. So this panel is to try to sort of let us discuss some of these issues and determine sort of what can be done and what our role as science communicators is in all of this. And to help us get some perspectives and begin to answer these questions, we've assembled a panel of experts on various aspects of science communication, education, outreach, and policy. So I'll go ahead and let them introduce themselves and just say a little bit about where they're coming from and what they do. And I guess let's do that in alphabetical order. So that would be starting with Ralph. You can unmute yourself.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ralph Bouquet. I'm the Director of Education and Outreach for NOVA, the PBS Science documentary series produced at WGBH in Boston. In that role, I oversee the production of educational resources from NOVA's broadcast and digital content, as well as a wide range of science communication events ranging from science cafes, community screenings of NOVA films, appearances at science festivals and conferences, and really seeing how we can extend the impact and rather specifically the long tail impact of NOVA films in communities across the country.
All right, great. Thanks for that. And now Dominique.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. It's so nice to see there are so many people that are connecting today. So my name is Dominique Brossard. I'm a professor and the chair of the Department of Life Sciences Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've been studying public perception of controversial science broadly construed, more particularly in the context of risky issues for close to 20 years. As a matter of fact, I wrote a number of papers on Zika, H1N1, Ebola, you name it. And now, as you can imagine, quite busy looking at psychology of risk related to the pandemic and they see what we can do as far as science communication is concerned. I'm part of a big task force here in Wisconsin where we are working with the Wisconsin League of Municipalities, science communication practitioners, psychologists, and researchers to develop messaging. And I'm really looking forward to discussing all this with you today. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Ollie?
Hi, everybody. I'm Nouri. I, like many of you, was a grad student once. I was a molecular biologist. After finishing up my grad work, I decided to shift to public policy. Ended up working in the Congress for 10 years as a Senate staffer on science technology issues. And as of 2018, I've come to the Federation of American Scientists, which is the organization that I am currently the president of. This is an organization that works on public policy issues, especially issues that are at the interface of science and policy. We were founded in 1945, and actually one of our issues in our charter back in 1945 was to fight disinformation. So it's interesting how we're talking about disinformation 75 years later. So we do a range of work, anywhere from nuclear weapons policy to infectious disease and COVID. And finally, we do a lot of work with the US Congress to make sure that members of Congress have access to evidence-based policies and to scientists. Great to be with you today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. And last but not least, Sam.
Hi, everybody. My name is Samantha Yamin. If you're going to talk about me, please say nice things and use the pronouns she and her. I am a neuroscientist by training. I finished my PhD last year from the University of Toronto studying how stem cells build and maintain the brain. But during my PhD, I started doing science communication through social media under the moniker of Science Sam. And that's kind of been the way that I got into science communication, completely self-taught and just by trying it out and being iterative to see what works. And I have to be honest, I'm really excited to learn from my fellow panelists because they're the people who I've been looking to try to figure out best practices as I've gone. And so thanks for having me, and can't wait to talk with everyone.
Yeah, I'm hoping we can all learn from each other. So I have a couple questions prepared, but this can all be very organic. So attendees, feel free to either raise your hand and we can have your question come up, or write something in the chat. But yeah, to kick things off, I thought I would start with a really huge question to get your guys' opinions on. So how can we as scientists and science communicators combat misinformation and reach people who have expressed skepticism around things like the global pandemic or other sorts of polarizing scientific topics? What sorts of strategies can we use? How should we proceed?
I'm happy to jump in. Well, thank you for the excellent question. You know, as you said, we are living in a time of disinformation, and it's been so bad during the pandemic, of course, that the World Health Organization calls it an infodemic. So it's so important for scientists and others working on these issues to communicate what they're doing to the general public. I'll just, as a practical matter, I'll name a couple projects that we have initiated at the Federation of American Scientists that your viewership might be interested in participating in. The first one is called Ask a Scientist. So it's pretty straightforward. And the idea is, if you have a question on COVID-19, you can go to covid19.fas.org and literally ask one of 600 scientists. These are largely graduate students, postdocs, early faculty members, about any aspects of the disease or the response. Any question that you have, and through a network that we've partnered with, the National Science Policy Network, which is a wonderful network of thousands of early career scientists around the world. Folks are regularly answering questions, emailing back their responses, and all those responses also go back into the initial site so that when someone asks a question, that response automatically pops up. So it's a neat feature, and again, it works because of this crowdsourcing mechanism and the volunteerism of so many scientists like all of you. So that's our project to educate the public. We also have another project aimed specially at members of Congress, because if you think about it, members of Congress, for the most part, they don't have science and technology backgrounds, right? They tend to be generalists. They get elected because they can work on lots of issues and talk to lots of audiences. So in the House of Representatives, for example, you have 2 science PhDs. In the Senate, you have none. In fact, we haven't had a science PhD in the Senate since 1983. And at the staff level, people are just very busy handling lots of different things. So what we try to do is we try to complement the lack of expertise within Congress with scientists on the outside. So we have various programs that connect academics in universities working on various research projects to lawmakers to help them navigate the world of COVID and other issues that are of technical nature. If you're interested in any of this, if you're interested in being involved in any of this, please do email us at sciencepolicy@fas.org. Thanks.
I'll be happy to jump in here. I'd like to step back a little bit. We did write a number of pieces. We did some shuffle here at UW-Madison and our excellent grad students looking at the issue of misinformation, infodemics, and so on. The problem that we have right now is like science is far from certain. So what are we correcting? And the way we correct it may actually proven to be dismissed tomorrow. And this is exacerbated by the fact that we do, have a number of studies that get communicated and have been sent around before peer-reviewed. And actually, if you don't follow an excellent blog by Ivan Oransky that's called Retraction Watch, I suggest for you to do it. And they've been doing a great job looking at all those studies that have been criticized and so on. So I think that before thinking about the combating misinformation, we should be careful as science communicators to actually continue stressing the uncertainty that by nature goes on when we try to do science. To some extent, the best way to present science is to say the goal of scientific research is to reduce uncertainty, right? And that to make it more and more certain, but we never achieve complete certainty. And I think right now, the fact that sometimes journalists tend to present the science as more certain than it is comes and backfires. So all of us together, I think, number one, we can actually portray the process of scientific research as that search for uncertainty rather than presenting facts. And number two, we can actually advocate for people to stop sending around studies that haven't been vetted by their colleagues. But I'll be happy to elaborate more later on.
Yeah, I did want to say, I do think a big problem that we have with regards to how we approach skepticism is, I think, an important part of the process begins with us identifying what the source of that skepticism is and how it might be uniquely tied to people's identities or impacted by mistrust or sort of historical precedents that have framed people's perceptions of the world. I think in what we're seeing right now with the case of COVID-19, I think it's really important to think about sort of what is there sort of instances or other cases in which the institutions that are delivering this information haven't sort of gained trust in those communities, and are there ways in which sort of our approaches to public health sort of have assumptions about people's desire to, you know, work towards a collective good, which may sometimes be a bit misguided. And I say this sort of looking at some of the incidents that we've seen, particularly with, I think, a lot of pushback against public safety guidelines related to COVID-19. I think we do have to sort of acknowledge the fact that there are ways in which, particularly in America, for example, people's sort of conceptions of freedom sort of come without an understanding of responsibility. People's understandings of liberty sometimes don't come with an understanding of what it means to do things for the nature of the collective good. And I think sometimes in many public health communications, there's this assumed sort of collective understanding that public health communicators assume that people have about these issues, that people often haven't been educated on in themselves. And often sometimes these beliefs are in conflict with sort of their core values of what they feel like, or what it means to sort of exist as an American. And so I do think that's a challenge that I think we've uniquely seen, and particularly over the course of the past few months with regards to how public health sort of messages have been communicated. And obviously, I think there's a lot of conflicting messages that are being communicated, particularly from people's in authority about what needs to be done and what actually should be done to keep people safe. And so I think that's a very sort of challenging problem. And I do think there needs to be a lot more dialogue and exchange between public health communicators, science communicators, and really work around even thinking about social psychology around sort of how people sort of create trust with these institutions, and how to ensure that, you know, people are making decisions and communicating messages in ways that will reach and sort of disentangle some of those complexities of how people think about themselves and how they think about what it means to sort of do things for the collective good.
I only want to briefly add, like, I love that point that you brought up and thinking about people's identities and why they might have a personal conflict with listening. But I also want to say, I don't know that the goal of, I know that my goal as a science communicator isn't to convince people. It isn't to change people's mind or tell them authoritatively how to act. It's to empower them with information to make the best decision for them. And I think a problem that a lot of scientists have and need to deal with, and a lot of institutions have, is that we think science is the only thing that goes into a decision. It's not. There are so many other factors. Economics is important. People's social situations are important. And we're seeing this now even more so with Black Lives Matter movements, where like science has been really shady to Black communities. And we can't just be now up in our ivory tower telling people, well, you have to listen to us, because there are reasons why people don't trust us, and we need to now just give the information that we've been withholding, and realize how we can move forward all together. And instead of just like talking at people what they need to do differently. We're just trying to give the information. And when you let people know, I'm not trying to take away your autonomy, I'm just trying to let you know that Judy Mikovits isn't the expert she says she is, then I think you can have the difficult conversations with people. I don't care what you end up doing. I respect your freedoms, but I just want you to know, I want you to not be fooled. Don't get got by someone who doesn't have your best interest in mind.
Can I just jump in and make a point about that? I fully agree with Samantha, in that it's not so much about science dominating and monopolizing the conversation, but it's about science being at the table, as you said, Samantha. And within the public, that's certainly the case, but it's also the case in policymaking bodies. My experience working on the Hill was one where every day I was working with different constituencies. And it was really cool because every issue that you deal with, you have 5, 6, 7 different set of stakeholders who sit around a table who have to compromise and get to a position that everybody can agree with. And what was unfortunate was just that oftentimes, even when the issue was one that impacted science or that could be informed by science, scientists were not part of that discussion. And I think a lot of that is cultural in the science culture. A lot of it is the fact that in graduate school, in part of the tenure process, we don't encourage scientists to get involved in those kinds of things. And those are changing. I mean, my graduate experience was very different than yours. We did not have anything to the extent of the kind of sophisticated way that students today are talking about these issues. But I think that culture change needs to happen, and scientists just need to step out of the labs more and into the public arena. And it's great to see that you're all doing that. And I think we need to talk more to our universities and our home institutions and our departments to try to get those incentives created so more and more people can participate in the public life and in the democratic process.
I'm going to jump in here, and I agree that climate is changing. As a matter of fact, we did publish another study. It looks like we keep on publishing studies. I guess it's our job. As far as the climate is changing, but I also would urge that we don't want everybody, all the scientists out there communicating and feel empowered to do so without knowing what they do. I mean, some is actually taking time to read the Science of Science Communication, and others that are actually here. We have a number that are fellows for the Rita Foundation, so I don't want to put you on the spot. You all know who you are, working really hard to actually be a science communicator, but also, as Ralph was saying, taking into account the social psychology behind it. Because I think building up on what Ralph and Sam were saying, the notion of trust is extremely important. The reason why Sam can tell her big following things about who's an expert or not is because people believe her. And they know that she's not judging her followers. She's actually, dialoguing with them and listening and responding and so on. And she can do that because she did build trust. Because if we think about it, we think of misinformation. And we may think that people are misguiding in believing, pandemic. But this video is, featuring a scientist who talks like a scientist, who has the credential of scientist. So we expect people to know that this person is not believable. She is believable. I mean, she's just using those side of science that we urge our public audience to use all the time. So the question is, how can we use platforms with followers or exchange information with people that trust us, or who is the right person to talk? It may not be a scientist, maybe somebody else. It may be the very trusted community leader and so on. So I think we need to be careful when we talk about that misinformation infodemic, to think there's a one size fits all type of answer. And we'll also urge us to really remember social psychology when we do all that.
Yeah, okay, these are all really great points. And we have a lot of questions already from attendees. So let me see if I can pull out some that touch on these sorts of concepts of trust and who's an expert. Okay, so this person, Allison, says, it seems like SciComm practice is conflicted about whether or not we should specifically address misinformation campaigns when we're communicating with people and trying to sort of guide them to the right resources, or if it's better to not give those wrong or incorrect messages more airtime. So do you panelists have any thoughts or opinions about what sorts of approaches we use, whether we should call things out specifically, or whether we should try to guide people, whether we should focus on building trust? Like how do we handle this?
Timothy Caulfield wrote a review recently about addressing misinformation and conspiracy theories. And one of the points that was brought up was that, early on when something's just getting traction, you might not want to draw more attention to it if it hasn't been seen by many people. But when it gets to the mainstream and when it's being shared so broadly, I think you have to. And in fact, if you talk to people, which as science communicators, we should talk to people, not just talk at them, you'll see that they're curious. And as soon as, my rule is as soon as more than one person has asked the same question, I'm like, I need to talk about it because it's on people's minds. And in fact, there's pretty good evidence that addressing that misinformation head on can be very productive. Being compassionate about it, and as Dominique said, you're not judging people is very important, but addressing it head on, there isn't a huge risk of backfire, and it lets people know that they should at least think twice before resharing it and giving it ability to spread further. And I think there's quite good data for that. And I think the concerns people have are not as founded in evidence as they might think.
Ali, you're muted. There we go.
Sorry, I'll just jump in. The way we tend to think about it, at least when it comes to disinformation, is sort of, it comes in three buckets, right? The types of people that you can engage with. 1/3, might be people who are hardened, so to speak, people who, may be actively spreading disinformation. The other third might be people who, are looking for facts. They tend to, retweet established evidence-based scientific facts, whatnot. And then the other third are people who haven't necessarily formed an opinion either way, but they're looking for information. And we think it's important to focus on that group, not at the exclusion of the others, but just in the sense that we have limited resources and energy. We think it's important to inoculate, so to speak, inoculate people from receiving bad information in the future by sort of warning them, priming them that watch out, this is coming. So let me give you some, let me engage you with some accurate information now, so when the bad stuff comes, you're ready for it. And I think that's, we think that's important, especially today in the context of a COVID-19 vaccine that will hopefully arrive at some point, within the next year, hopefully. And we've already seen a major uptick in campaigns from anti-vaxxers to influence that particular group that is very vulnerable. So to the extent that we can engage that group, and again, inoculate them from bad information, just in the same way that you want to inoculate people from a vaccine, that's where we're trying to focus our resources.
And one thing I will add, I do think there has to be a concerted effort in many of our educational institutions to really sort of stress the importance of developing strong digital media literacy skills. I think there's an assumption that we often have that that younger people, like sort of Gen Z, is sort of, because of the ways in which they are digital natives, that there's this assumption that they are already equipped to deal with this and to be a lot more perceptive and discerning about the content they consume. And I think there's a Stanford study that showed that for many middle schoolers, like even their ability to sort of decipher or sort of delineate between editorialized piece versus sort of news reporting piece is definitely continues to be a struggle. And so I think that there needs to be just a general concerted effort to make sure that people feel supported and feel like they have really sort of simple heuristics for being more decisive when they encounter news, being able to sort of check their emotions, when you see something that's hyperbolic or clearly designed to sort of generate an emotional response, checking sources. I mean, these are really basic things that I think often, we sort of silo it only into the space of like, all right, this is the ELA stuff that you need to do. But I think it needs to be integrated a bit more comprehensively to informing a lot of the best practices that people should use when they're sort of encountering any type of information online. And I think that is part of the problem. I mean, one of the things that we're doing at NOVA, we have a program called the NOVA Science Studio, which is really focused on providing space and opportunities to really create a pipeline of diverse young science communicators starting in high school. And so one of our core aspects and core focuses of the program is really in highlighting digital media literacy skills, sort of as a foundational, skill that these students need to have in order to become effective science communicators and to be more decisive in what they share and in informing what they produce as well.
Yeah, I think that's oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I wanted to actually applaud Ralph's view here on the strong digital literacy, and actually some research in educational psychology shows that you can teach middle schoolers to counter the cognitive bias, because going back to like a point that several speakers have made is like the question is not that we want to correct misinformation. The question is we want to understand why people believe it, which is a different thing. So, and people believe the information for various reasons. I'm going to tell a very brief anecdote here. I have a friend who's a hairstylist, and she has a little studio, small business, and she was really doing everything she needed to do when she, her business was closed, social distancing and so on. And it just happened that in Wisconsin, this was supposed to stop the whole stay at home on April 26th. And on April 26th, the government did a big communication mistake. He just announced on April 26th, but everybody was like, yay, we're going out. This is another month. Really bad. That was so bad. And we were working with him. So anyway, so my friend, the hairstylist, is stuck, right? And she cannot open and so on. And then pandemic comes. She posted on Facebook. And then being my friend, I'm like saying, hey, why are you posting that? As a matter of fact, she's not an expert and so on. And she said, you know what? I just want to go back to my studio and make people happy again. This looked reasonable. That's why I believed it. And so she was easy to convince otherwise. But the reason was not that, we could teach her not to believe information. She wanted to believe it, And so like in this case, strong relationships are more important than actually correcting the facts.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like a lot of these more sort of interpersonal skills and understanding motivations and building trust is super important, and not necessarily even something that us as science communicators have a lot of experience with. So do you see that as kind of our role? Should we focus on this sort of softer side of trying to build relationships with people, or should we work on how to guide them to existing information? What do you see as sort of the balance for people like us, graduate students who are scientists and science communicators?
I think the grassroots approaches are very important in any movement and any communication all the time. Individuals can really make a difference. If you can be a friendly face of science for even 3 people, that is so powerful, because it's in the small groups from conversations between individuals where you get mistrust building. And so if you can just even be the face that people think of when they're like, hold on, maybe not all scientists are evil. I really like my friend, Dana. And so I don't think that, I don't know if I'm going to believe this. I think us fostering relationships is so important. It's a long game. I don't care if someone wants to believe one wrong thing. It doesn't matter to me, but long term, I want them to have some faith and to be thinking of that. And with that, I think we need to look as a community for our goal not to be to have like another Bill Nye. A lot of people say they want to be the next Bill Nye. I don't want to be the next Bill Nye. I want there to be thousands of Bill Nyes, because that's the only way we're going to reach the thousands of people that we're not reaching. there needs to be a Bill Nye for every community, for every different, as Ralph was saying, every different identity people have. They need to have their own Bill Nye, because it's only through those in-group kind of conversations and relationships where you're going to really have people open to conversation and trusting each other, instead of having knee-jerk reactions based on the fact that they just want to move on from this and personal feelings they might have.
Just to pick up on some of what Samantha said, I totally agree. I think getting out there is important, of course, in a careful way, as Dominique pointed out. We still want some level of consensus before we go out there with the information. That's very important. But right now, we are grossly mismatched, right? Because we know that sensationalist information, just for example, on social media, just travels much faster, much wider than being methodical and putting information, scientifically vetted information out there. And currently, at least, the science community, in large part, we rely on getting people together, sitting down, spending months working on a project, putting out a research report that's 80 pages to 200 pages. And quite frankly, not that many people are reading that material. Even policymakers tend to not read that material. So there's this asymmetric warfare going on, and we need to be faster, right? And the challenge is, how do you move rapidly but also methodically and thoughtfully? And how do you make something, for example, go viral on the internet, even if it's a fact-based and not a sensational piece of engagement? And I think one example of this that was effective, I think, was the flattening the curve charts that were circulated back in February, right? This is what happens if you don't social distance, you overwhelm hospitals. This is what happens if you do social distance. And that went viral. And I think that really moved people. It really moved policymakers. But as science communicators and as a community, I think we need to be better trained and really think about what are those creative ways where we can engage the public more effectively.
Yeah, that's great. That's actually a perfect segue. I was going to ask an attendee question from Krista about what sorts of science communication initiatives during the whole COVID-19 pandemic you think were well done, and maybe why that is. And I think flatten the curve graphic was pretty compelling. But I'm wondering if anyone else has other examples, either visual or I guess text or speech based, that they think are a good example of how to do this.
Dominique, go ahead.
No, I just want to mention that, like, the flatten the curve one, I mean, when you say it's a great example, I would go back to, communication basics with for whom and for which goal, because I don't think like the flatten the curve actually appealed to everyone. As a matter of fact, I talked to a lot of people in the community that were not really quite sure what it meant. And I've been very vocal talking about how predictive models tend to, to evolve and what does it mean and so on, because actually people were really confused and didn't really know. So I think it did work very well with some audiences and it may not with the other. And so it goes back to that idea that let's make sure we know who we are talking with, who are we engaging with, and not assume that all audiences are the same and the message will resonate. As a matter of fact, at the local level, even in Wisconsin, if you look at the African-American community in Milwaukee we've been working with, and you compare that to the northern Wisconsin, very conservative white populations, very different messages have been resonated with these audiences. So I think we need to, when we say they've worked well, it's for whom and for which purpose is something that we need to think about.
Yeah, that's a great point. Anyone else? Ali?
Sure. Yeah, just to jump in, I totally agree. The audience is always important with any kind of communication, and there's no such thing as a cookie cutter approach that's going to work for everyone. I think one of the issues that we've grappled with is the public policymakers, they don't really understand to the extent that we would like them to how the scientific process works, right? And this also gets back to what we were saying earlier on about also communicating the uncertainties. That is just, matter of fact, we don't have all the answers. I mean, if we look at this pandemic in the last 3 months, I don't care, who the scientist was and how famous they were. Everybody got something wrong during this crisis. And, we can't blame them because it was a new virus. It was a new kind of crisis, a new kind of pandemic. We were trying to move very, very quickly. And mistakes are made along the way, right? First, the guidance was don't wear masks, and then the guidance was wear masks. First, it was thought that we don't have asymptomatic spread. Now we know we do. And in fact, WHO still stumbled in its communication tactic on that issue, 4 months into the pandemic. So I think explaining to folks that, there are uncertainties and we don't have all the perfect answers is important. That's number one. But the second piece is, I think as scientists, we have an obligation to communicate better what we're doing in the lab. And unfortunately, right now, we don't have those incentives. If, for example, NIH or NSF, which are funding the research that scientists do, if they had bigger programs on science communication, and they do this to a certain extent, but if we had funding to actually make really cool movies and images and various media tools to communicate all the cool research that's happening in the lab to the external communities, I think that would really help build some science trust. I was just going to end by saying, one of the things that pandemic had going for it was it was well funded, right? That was part of the reason why it spread so rapidly. We just don't fund science communication in the way that could benefit from more public engagement and understanding of science.
I just want to add, though, I don't think government-based funding will be the answer. I cannot, just for full disclosure, I cannot get any kind of government grant for anything I do. It's just not valued. I think it should be valued, and I think that's what you're suggesting, is that we need to value it more. But at the end of the day, who those government grants go to and how slow that they move, it's never going to be responsive enough. And that's why I'm a big fan of grassroots. Like, again, I can give metrics like crazy. I'm reaching this many people and it's not an echo chamber and I have all this data, can't get a grant. And I think it's just too slow anyway. There's no time to apply. So I think the grassroots approach is where, you can use a model like Patreon or Coffee is what I've been using, and fund independent communicators to be communicating to their communities. I think that's got to be the way. And now Instagram's monetizing IGTV, and I think that's where you're going to get funding to people who actually have reach instead of people who have academic prestige who governments are going to give out grants to. It's just too slow. But I agree, we need to be valuing and paying for it. That way people can actually do the good work. But the question of who that money goes to is just a mess. And not that I'm the only deserving one, but there's just lots of people doing good work who cannot get funding for it.
Yeah, and you're right about that. Those structures were created 70, 80 years ago, and in many cases, they just haven't kept up with the times.
So I totally agree, Sam, and this is an antique system of grant funding and so on that needs to evolve. So I do believe in a strong partnership between practitioners and academics, and hopefully, Sam, we're going to follow on our research ideas. But and also, just so you know, NSF is evolving. I'm actually the upcoming chair of the advisory board for social behavior and economic science. Maybe condolence, I don't know. But and there is that really big move into making sure that practice meets academia for all those important wicked problems that society has to solve. So we can do it together. It's not academia in the ivory tower or practitioners in their practice. It's something that it needs to come together. ASL grants from the NSF was the beginning of that, but I hope this is going to move towards that, to be much more proactive and rapid grant proposals and so on. So stay tuned.
Yeah, these are all, oh wait, go ahead, Ali.
No, I was just going to say, you're going to fix it. I support it.
All right, you heard that, attendees. So we still have some more questions from the chat, but if people want to raise their hand, we can ask questions that way. And for those of you who are watching the live stream on YouTube, you can also type your questions in the comments there and we can try to get to them. So yeah, feel free to use the raise hand. Let me see if I can find another good question. So going back to, I guess, the topics we were talking about before with sort of building trust with people and sort of empowering them to seek out information on their own and improve sort of information literacy skills. Do you have any sort of recommendations for specific strategies we can use to empower people so that they feel like we're not speaking down to them or being condescending, but we're trying to help them sort of grow in their critical thinking and not just trying to, prove our sort of biased point?
I'm happy to just jump in and say, I think oftentimes what we tend to do is we talk about our research, because it's interesting to us, and we don't always put it in a context that's interesting to the audience. What is it about, my research that can help you? What is it that can ultimately help you? I think, as scientists, we tend to be really focused on communicating the data, which is extremely important. But I think there's an element of matching that data to emotion, because that's the thing that people resonate with. So I find it when I try to do that and put it in the context of both something that can be useful and more of an emotional appeal, an emotional context, that tends to work better.
I also think just our first job as communicators is to listen before we speak, and just listen to what people are worried about, listen to what they're asking, listen, then open your mouth for a bit, then listen again. And I think when you're communicating as a friend and as someone who cares, people will forgive your mistakes and people will take to heart what you're saying. I think we just talk a lot. We just listen a lot more. And I'm part of that problem, but listening.
Yeah, I guess all of these sorts of conversations about building trust and reaching communities, thinking about our audiences and who we're trying to actually communicate with, kind of brings up some of the other sorts of current events. So I'll ask a question more related to that. So as we all know, right now, the United States at least is really reckoning with some of all of the inequalities that are built into our country's institutions. And we've seen that this permeates all aspects of society, including science and public health, with this being really relevant for COVID-19, at least, in that Black people and other racial minorities account for a disproportionate number of the COVID-19 cases and fatalities in both the United States and Canada. And I have to believe that at least some of that is due to the information or lack thereof that people are receiving. And so I'm wondering how we can acknowledge these ties between social and scientific issues, and how we can use science communication to better communicate and reach marginalized communities who might not be sort of targeted by our initiatives that we have right now.
Yeah, I would say, I think a big part of this is, I do think scientists, I think it's incumbent on scientists to become more aware of how these systemic issues sort of were created and continue to be reinforced by racism, by economic inequality. I think a good case study for this is sort of in thinking about how we communicate and how we sort of follow the thread and follow the stories. I think sometimes there is a fear of sort of, once you get to sort of politics, once you get to a policy directive that is informing or causing situation, sometimes that's where the communication ends, or sometimes that's where the story ends, for fear of being seen as being partisan. And I do think that it's really important and incumbent for us to continue to follow those threads and to use, again, the same strategies, the same sort of logic that we use sort of in their research to tell these stories and to tell them holistically and completely. So, I mean, a good example for this will be in sort of discussions around COVID-19 comorbidities, right? One which is asthma and other sort of respiratory illnesses. So we know that asthma prevalence is higher for Black people than for white people in this country. Asthma rates in Black children are double than those of white children. Asthma is more prevalent in communities that contain more air pollutants, so the EPA has sort of the air quality index that measures sort of air pollutants in communities. There was a 2018 APA study that found that people of color are much more likely to live near polluters, they're more likely to breathe polluted air. People who are in poverty are more exposed to a lot more of the fine particulate matter that can contribute to sort of severe asthma and asthma attacks. And so, if we're going to reckon with this information, then we have to really interrogate sort of why are these communities in these regions? What are the systemic issues? What are the active decisions that have been made by people in power, to shape these communities, to redline, to create sort of economic disparity that keeps people in these communities and that reinforce where these people live in these communities, that are driving these comorbidities that are contributing to their deaths in these communities. So I think we have to reconcile the fact that many of these things are connected to decisions that have been willfully made by people in power, and that contributes to sort of these issues. And so I think often when we have the opportunity to communicate these stories, you cannot just stop at asthma and there's some environmental racism there. You have to say, okay, so what are the levers? What are the decisions that were made that caused this? And I think that takes, re-engaging, more deeply with sort of the history of this country and interrogating it more quickly. I think being a lot more, just doing a better job of, again, following the thread, following those stories, and being holistic in your approach to telling and explaining what's happening. I think we can't conveniently choose to look away from the facts that exist because politics are involved. If political decisions cause things to happen that inform these impacts that we are seeing, then I think it's important for science communicators to acknowledge that and to inform the public about that. And I think we cannot silo these conversations away from the impacts that we're seeing, and also think about sort of what are the solutions that need to be happening in order to address those comorbidities. So what needs to happen in order to reshape the ways in which communities are organized, what needs to happen with regards to thinking about why certain communities disproportionately are more likely to be prone to living closer to highways and to factories that pollute, that create a lot of air pollutants that contribute to these diseases that cause that are contributing to these high rates. What it is about the way in which certain groups, particularly Black and Latino populations, are sort of in these essential worker positions that create more opportunities for exposure. And so I think there's just a lot of these connections that sometimes I think in a lot of science communication, we sort of stop, at the convenient places because of a fear of getting partisan, and I think we avoid sort of acknowledging the real ways in which a lot of these issues are being shaped by active political decisions that have been made in the past, but are being made now and are being reinforced continuously by policymakers, by people who have positions of power, by people who are doing urban planning. And that's just one case of just like asthma and COVID-19. I think there are many other cases where we can see this. If you look at the Cancer Alley in the South, if you look at sort of movements being made to sort of restrict protests on gas lines and things like that to ensure that people aren't having these conversations, I think we need to really interrogate and confront how these are impacting these communities and contributing to the fatalities, to the cases, and to the massive amounts of suffering that many Black communities, many Latino communities are facing across this country.
I think what Ralph just said was a whole sermon and important lesson. And if you take away one thing from this entire panel, I hope it was what he just said, because it is a problem all the way down to the way that we do science, where we collect race data that doesn't even really make sense. Like what race is very much a old and historic construct, and based in eugenics. It's not really what we're really trying to talk about are other things that we haven't interrogated yet. We just collect the race thing and then we move on instead of what the underlying factor is, exactly as Ralph said. So it's actually even bad science, and then we collect it and then we say it and then we just move on and we don't address the actual underlying thing. We make bad correlations, And it's just not helpful. And it's a problem with how we do science. And then it becomes a problem with how we communicate it. And we go to blame the individual. Oh, well, you're more affected because you're Black or you're Latina or whatever. And it's not about that. It's about some other factor that person had nothing to do with. It's not that people are even trying to make claims that people in these marginalized communities are not listening. That's actually not true. There were surveys done that they're listening more than white communities are. But that they have factors that don't allow them to take the policy. And yet then so anyways, what Ralph said was the most important thing, and we need to acknowledge that. And we also need to acknowledge the fact that if you look at all the mainstream science channels, for example, I've been to these producer meetings, and I've also received briefings for science communication projects where it says that the target demographic is like the quote unquote Caucasian people, males in particular, and I'm putting these all in quotes because I don't like any of these words. But I just want you to realize that not only are we dismissing people and blaming them, we're not giving them, and they're still getting the right information anyway, and we're not even trying to get to them. Just everything that we're doing is wrong. So I just want to, just go back and listen to what Ralph just said again. That's all.
Yeah, several of our attendees, I'm just skimming the chat, are coming up with some of the sort of initiatives and efforts that they know of to do SciComm in other languages or with typically, under-reached populations. So I'm wondering if the panelists have particular suggestions for things that we should be aware of or maybe get involved in that might help with this.
Well, I would just to put in a plug for our Ask a Scientist project. And by the way, I like Samantha, I second everything Ralph said. I could not have said any of it more eloquently. So I'm just going to defer to him. But our Ask a Scientist project is translated into Spanish at the moment, and we do have an effort to translate it into additional languages. So to the extent that there are scientists out there listening who are well versed in the science and can communicate in multiple languages, we more than invite you to work with us and get that information out there, at least through that medium.
And just to do a plug also for the project I'm involved right now in Wisconsin, we have actually a number of resources actually in 10 languages, including Hmong, which is a big community here in Wisconsin. A Spanish population, we're doing things for children, coloring books in Spanish, where the coloring book is actually like communicating issues about COVID and so on. So I can send the link to all those initiatives if people are interested.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And to the point about resources, I do think that it's important to, again, circulate and generate lists, particularly, I think, focus on the history of science and specifically on sort of the intersection of science and medical racism. And I think, I mean, one of the books that I always recommend, Harriet Washington's Medical Apartheid, I think is a really good foundational text for at least thinking about the context of medical and scientific racism in America and in the US, and sort of how that, ways in which sort of that has, I think, engendered quite a bit of mistrust, I think, in communities that I think are part of, I think, can contribute to some of the issues we're talking about, but also I think it's incumbent on us to also interrogate the institutions themselves and how they continue to perpetuate ideas and behaviors that that create and contribute to disparities. I mean, there's, I think, the UVA study looking at sort of doctors' perceptions of pain in Black and white patients, for example. Just as sort of like a very basic sort of diagnostic things that doctors have to do all the time, and how that's being informed too by very sort of archaic and racist notions of pain sensitivity between Black and white patients. And so what does that cause? What does that contribute? That contributes to people, again, not getting sort of good diagnostic interpretation of what their condition is. It contributes to them maybe not getting the same amount of referrals. And the thing is, like, even when you control for, for income, even when you control for education level of patients, this stuff continues to persist. And so I think part of that, part of the goal, I think, and that we need to really evaluate when we sort of interrogate our institutions is sort of, is education happening to these people who have to do this work in a way that informs them and in a way that addresses these biases, and in a way that, again, displaces a lot of the suffering that we see, not on just sort of the people who are experiencing it, but really on, you know, the ways in which these institutions sometimes uphold it and contribute to it. And so I think that's part of the conversation too, is really sort of educating ourselves to know about these issues, and taking a sort of interdisciplinary approach to considering the history and considering the social contexts that are contributing to these disparities, and then coming up with solutions that focus on education, that focus on the resource and distribution of resources to ensure that a lot of these situations don't continue.
I just want to make a really quick plug to following and supporting independent communicators who are communicating in culturally relevant ways. You can find a bunch of Black scientists to follow on Twitter. If you go to Esther Odekunle, if you go to her profile, she has a thread with 700 Black scientists who you can, literally 700. So they're there, follow those individuals and those grassroots efforts. I just came across Free Radicals. They're on Instagram at freerads.org, and they're a group committed to social justice in the way that they do science communication. And so in addition to following those individuals, I'm going to ask that you also unfollow and take away social currency from people who aren't doing this type of work. If someone is featuring scientists who are all like white guys, or just people, even women, but women who like don't seem to give a crap beyond their own experiences, unfollow those people, take away the social currency that you have through your likes and comments, and take away platform as much as you give it, because we allow a lot of shenanigans to proliferate in the science communication space because we feel that we need to follow certain individuals with clout. Just take away their power one person by one person.
Yeah, I think those are great points about diversifying our media intake and continuing to educate ourselves. And just a reminder for the attendees that we have a channel on our Slack where we're all sharing these sorts of resources so that we can read and learn these things on our own time and continue to discuss them. Okay, so I have finally noticed that there is a hand up in the chat. Sorry, I'm trying to monitor all of these different streams. So Joseph, you have had your hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate y'all's time and expertise. Thank you. I have a question about, so there's popular science. I have a question about what it would look like to do popular philosophy of science, popular history of science, and popular STS, which is science and technology studies. So these are all fields which can help us understand the ways in which science is socially situated. It's based on the experience, the material conditions of the people that make it, on their limitations, on their politics. And sometimes when people read this work, there's this kind of like fear of postmodernism, like, oh no, you're trying to, tear down, the scientific method and say that there isn't any order here. But what I found is that learning about all of these fields actually strengthens a lot of my belief in how science can do good and how people can be well-intentioned. Of course, there's all sorts of bad influences from corporations, politicians, the scientists themselves, but there's also kind of a much more powerfully true perspective on what's going on. I'm wondering what it would look like to tell those stories in a popular lens, knowing that there are costs because they're not immediately all interesting. Sometimes the academics can't speak in a down-to-earth way. And on some level, you are relativizing or taking authority away from scientists in a moment when we're in crisis or whatever. So I'm wondering what it would look like to do the work of making science less brittle, even if there are short-term costs of addressing all of these things that folks in the academy and media and in the world at large have pointed out. Thanks so much.
I can jump in. Actually, I totally agree with Joseph. And as a matter of fact, that link that was put out on the magazine from the National Academy of Science issues actually takes an STS perspective. And I have a minor in STS, and I agree with you that putting science on the pedestal and so on is part of the problem, that we've been taught to believe, and to think that those are facts without, taking into account how that social science knowledge was constructed. And as a matter of fact, I strongly advise all the grad students that that I can encounter to take classes in STS if they can, because I think it really broadened your understanding of us coming to see science from one side of the spectrum without really deconstructing it. There are some very visible, popular philosophers of science. I'm thinking Sheila Jazanov, I'm thinking Daniel Zorowitz, and so on, that in the policy realm are very, very, involved. They may not be as popular with like large public audiences, but certainly they do a very good job in trying to have that perspective be taken into account in policymaking. When we talk about expertise, for example, who are the experts? Is it the person who actually measures risk as a probability, or is it the person who understands how risk is constructed in a community? The whole notion of lay expertise, that people on the ground, activists, and so on. I mean, that's how we took a hold on the AIDS crisis, is because of that, right? All this is totally relevant, and the notion that lay knowledge actually comes from STS. So I applaud you. Thank you. And I hope a lot of science communicators will take also that angle to think about their practice.
Yeah, I think we need to break away from the rhetoric of I'm an expert, I'm a scientist, listen to me. Again, as Dominique said earlier, Judy is a molecular biologist. So those qualifications, those letters, that's just reinforcing gatekeeping that academia historically has had. It also just, there are people who go rogue and can't be trusted, Dr. Oz, etc. So we need to stop saying like, I'm a scientist, listen to me. No, none of that. Sometimes people need to emphasize their degrees because maybe they're someone who people will tend to listen to less. If you're a young woman, for example, people, I kind of have to overemphasize my degree so people will listen to me because I don't look like a scientist. Fine. But at the end of the day, that can't be the reason we're asking people to listen to us. And in my early days, I was a science cheerleader almost through my Instagram. I don't do that anymore because science doesn't really deserve a cheerleader until it deals with its problems. Even in the chat, people were saying, let's make friendly. And even earlier, I said, we need to be friendly faces of science. On one hand, yes, but on the other hand, we have to also be the friendly face in terms of how we communicate, but not just always saying science is perfect, because it's just not. And that is why people go on Goop, because Goop cares and science hasn't always cared about them.
Yeah, I do want to, I think it's a great point, Sam. I do want to acknowledge too that I want to give a big shout out to Ray because she put me onto this research, but research from Susan Fisk about sort of warmth versus competence and how just sort of the ways in which, the social cognition that happens when we evaluate people and who to trust and why we trust them. And so, when you look at that research, many scientists sort of rank high on competency, but sort of low on warmth. And so warmth is, crucial. It's a crucial dimension to, our perceptions of whether or not we can trust somebody, whether they're friendly, whether they're helpful. And so it's important that I think when we think about the stories that we tell, when we think about to the question about sort of, pop history of science, really being intentional about the characters and the people we choose, and thinking about how can we craft stories, how can we craft narratives that again sort of humanize these characters, but also I think do a good job of showing and highlighting the ways in which it is just so important for us to consider are these stories going to reach people if they do not feel reflected in them, if their experiences aren't reflected in them, if their concerns, then their material concerns aren't reflected in them. And I think we do have to dedicate a lot more energy and time to shaping our narratives in ways that will appeal to people's sort of material concerns, to the things that they are struggling to understand, to the issues that they're struggling to understand consistently. And I think it's I think there are many, many ways that that we can do that. And I think it begins with sort of being intentional about sort of the narratives and making sure that they are full, that they are complete, that they aren't ahistorical as well. I think that's a crucial piece about this.
Just to follow up on Ralph's point about storytelling and narrative, that's also something that's really important, not just with the public, but also with the policymakers. The example, that I have in people who do this really well, interaction with policymakers, members of Congress, from the time I spent up there, were actually people in the agriculture community, farmers. You know, we don't always think about the farmer from, you know, Minnesota or Wisconsin as being really politically savvy and telling a story well and having that narrative, but they really do. And you know, so and it's because of that really that you see the U.S. Congress pass a farm bill every 5 years. It's like clockwork, right? They always do a farm bill, and guess who's pretty much writing that farm bill? It is those farmers. And you know, part of that is through the narrative and the storytelling, and really making the narrative of the farmer the narrative of the member, because then that member of Congress, next time he or she visits the farm, they want to be able to tell that story, right? So they absorb the stories that they hear from their constituents when those are good stories. So storytelling is definitely a big piece of it. And then the other piece of it is just that relationship building. I mean, you know, we became friends almost with our farmer constituents, because they just constantly visited us, and you know, I mean, they're doing it because they realize the power of the federal government in supporting agriculture, right? There's a reason behind it, but you know, they really weave those into relationships. And it was, you know, if I had a question on agriculture, I knew exactly who to call because I'm meeting with these people on a regular basis. That's something that the scientists were actually not doing nearly as effectively. You know, there is a push, you know, among scientists, especially when they engage with policymakers. It's usually around science funding, right? More money for NIH, more money for NSF. It tends not to be for evidence-based policies, right? It's rare when you have a constituency that's pushing for evidence-based policies in the same way that you have a constituency that's pushing for agriculture or for NIH funding. So you know, those are the things that I would love for us to be better with, because that will directly translate into better public policies.
Great. Well, that is probably about all the time we have. So I want to thank you guys. This has been really eye-opening and inspiring, with lots of sort of big picture things to think about, strategies about, you know, connecting with people, being warm and empathetic and building trust, and lots of calls to action and links that I can see people are sharing in the chat. So thanks a lot. And attendees, I guess you can give a silent round of applause with me to our panelists. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.